So, good afternoon to those in the UK, good evening to those in Japan, and a warm welcome back to this quarterly Japan Society webinar, hosted jointly with Asia Society Tokyo. I am Bill Emmett. I'm an honorary vice chair of the Japan Society, and it is my great pleasure to moderate these Japan Macro Salons, reviewing the latest trends in Japan's economy, financial markets, and corporate world, and of course, how those trends affect and are affected by global events. This time, I have a sneaking suspicion we're going to spend a fair amount of time discussing the so-called Takaichi trade, as well, no doubt, as mentioning that man in the White House and his tariffs. Right now, everything noteworthy seems to begin with a T, including turmoil and turbulence, of course. But as our regular attendees know, every quarter in these salons to discuss these issues, I'm joined by our good friend Jesper Koll. Jesper is well known as a self-described Japan optimist, but also for more than 3 decades as one of the highest rated economists and strategists in Japan. Jesper has worked with the best, including JP Morgan and Merrill Lynch, and is now an expert director at the Monex Group, as well as a board director at the Okinawa Institute for Science and Technology, and, as I always stress, an advisor to us all. We're also, as always, being joined by a special guest, who I'm delighted to say is another old friend of the Japan Society, Leo Lewis, Tokyo Bureau Chief of the Financial Times. Leo has been in Tokyo for quite some time at the FT, both as Tokyo correspondent and as Asia business editor before taking over as bureau chief earlier this year. And before the FT, he worked also in Tokyo and then Beijing for the Times of London. Now, let me say right at the outset that the audience are the most important part of these salons. And so throughout this webinar, please feel free to submit questions at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and do vote for others' questions to bring them more quickly to my attention. As always, I'll begin by picking Jesper's brains about recent economic trends before bringing our guest in. But given the centrality of Takaichi-san's election last Saturday as leader of the LDP, we're going to change things a bit for this show, and Leo is on screen straight away so that we can review matters both with Jesper and with Leo. First of all, a warm welcome to you both from the Japan Society and the Asia Society, of course. Now, Jesper, before getting on to the rather enthusiastic response by the Tokyo stock market to Takaichi's victory, perhaps I could ask you what you think are the most important things in the background of Japan's economy and markets that she and the new government will need to contend with. What have you noticed in the last few weeks that you want to bring to our attention?
So very, very important. There's sort of a couple of a couple of new evidence that we have that the bullish thesis on Japan actually comes through in the data. And just let me point out a couple of them. The first one is that business investment expenditure here in Japan continues to be revised up. So despite the uncertainty over whatever goes on in China, whatever goes on in the United States, despite all of that, you find that the latest Tankan survey, shows yet another revision up in domestic capital investment expenditure. And we are now on track for the 3rd consecutive year of Japanese companies reinvesting in productive capital here in Japan. And if you look at the details, it's broad-based. It's the large companies, it's the small companies, it's the service sector, it's the manufacturing sector. So the animal spirits of corporate Japan showing up in actually investing in their business by both upgrading their capital stock as well as adding new capacity. All of that continues to go from strengths to strengths. And of course, when business leaders actually use their funding to actually invest in new capital, that's where it starts to get very interesting. That's when a brighter future starts to come through. The second point goes to another part of the corporate metabolism, which is the reality that over the last 24 months, basically slightly more than 11% of all listed companies have received a bid for a majority stake. So it's not just 7-Eleven, getting a bid from a Canadian company, but you actually find that this deregulation of the corporate code, the doing away with poison pills, the changes in the corporate governance and capital stewardship codes, together with, of course, the Tokyo Stock Exchange initiative, you can actually show a huge upward trend in bids by foreign entities being made for Japanese companies. Last year, there were a record 193 companies that received a bid. This year to date, until the end of August, we had 157, and we're on track for about 250 companies receiving a bid for majority stake this year, which means if you take this year and last year together, you've got more than 400 companies receiving a bid, which is basically 10% of the 4,000 or so listed companies that we've got in Japan. So it's quite incredible. And if you draw the line on that, you see that 5-6 years ago, there basically was nothing in terms of corporate metabolism. Now this is happening. So
That is,
very interesting.
if I might come in there, yes, but that is a fascinating statistic. Just to clarify, that is just foreign bids is 11%, or is that foreign and Japanese bids?
That is
And
foreign and Japanese bids. That's
right.
foreign and Japanese bids. It's interesting because some politician tried to peddle to me the idea that half of those bids are from Hong Kong and Taiwan. It's those Chinese wanting to buy us. And you cannot verify this. This is actually not true, right? The majority actually comes from the United States of America, domestic, and then it's the rest of Asia, right? So it's quite interesting that you have that. But again, the key point for those of us who are looking at Japan and remembering that Japan, the market for corporate control was basically completely closed, it is actually opening, right? And it's not just activist investors, it's not just private equity firms, but it's also, real owners and operating companies that are actually starting to make a bid and increasing their foothold here in Japan. So that I think is super important. And, yes, of course, the stock market did whatever it did, after Takaichi got elected. But the fundamental underpinnings, right, in terms of investing in the future, in terms of changing corporate managements, changing corporate control with more competition coming in is actually very, very exciting. And then the final data point before we get into the sexy part of policymaking and politics, right? And the final data point is I was asked to give a presentation to the Japan Productivity Center and a couple of politicians on productivity. And so I actually sat down and hid myself for an afternoon behind Excel spreadsheets. And it's actually amazing what happened to productivity. Let me give you the basic numbers. The population over the last 20 years, the population of Japan is down by 4%. GDP is up by 24%. So GDP per capita is up by 28%. Divided by 20, a little bit more than 1% in terms of productivity growth. But that's actually not correct because, of course, you need to look at hours worked. And hours worked, because of various reforms, have collapsed by about 1% every year. So the bottom line is, if you actually look at labor productivity, right, you find that labor productivity over the last 20 years has risen by 44%, which is incredible by any standard, right? That's basically a 2% per annum increase coming through. So productivity has been rising sharp. And now it gets interesting. Because then supposedly productivity is equal to compensation, right? That's what you're taught in economics. Well, not in the real world. For the first time in the history of Japan over the last 20 years, a gap has widened. Labor productivity is up 44%, but employee compensation is up only 14%. So there's a 30% gap that has risen, which explains why Mr. and Mrs. Watanabe are not happy. Great for capitalists, bad for labor. And that's a trade-off that actually Takaichi, or the next prime minister of Japan is actually going to have to contend with. The reality that productivity has risen much faster than workers' compensation. Add to that the reality that the number one, number two, number three concern of Mr. and Mrs. Watanabe, the number one, number two, number three reason for why the average Japanese is angry at the LDP, is angry at the ruling party, is because of inflation.
Yeah, exactly,
No?
exactly. Yeah, no, and that let me bring in now. Leo, you've been given billing by Jesper as being the sexy part of this conversation, so therefore we need you to live up to this. But we're hearing markets are bullish. The economy actually has some underlying forces underneath it, particularly helping corporate profits, but voters are angry. Why are these two things the case, and how do you see this evolving?
Yeah, so what I would add to everything that Jesper just said is that labor shortage is I think something that I am going to be spending a lot more time on, simply because it is, it is officially acute according to the Bank of Japan. Ueda clearly said that in August, and I think that the issue really is multifold, because one of the arguments, let's say the optimistic argument, has been that labor shortages create a sweet spot that do oblige companies to raise wages in a way that the country has needed for some time, that it creates labor market fluidity, some flexibility, there's movement between jobs. Those are all the positive sides of things. I think what's happening at the same time is that labor shortages are starting to affect the quality of service and the availability of service. And so I think that certain things that Japan has become used to are becoming less available. I think that we can see that sitting in Tokyo, sitting in the rest of Japan. You can clearly see where labor shortages starting to make themselves very clearly known. The buses in Tokyo went to a lower frequency in one of the areas because there weren't enough drivers. Now, if you're paying more for the bus ticket anyway, you notice if there are fewer buses as well. And that's true across the economy, that essentially we're seeing a shrinkflation, a service shrinkflation, where Japan is pretending that it's offering the same service that it always was. But in reality, labor shortages make that much more difficult. And so I think what that's doing is it's exacerbating the sense that inflation is now a problem, that the individual household not only feels constrained by those rising prices, but is also unhappy about the value that they're getting for the money they are spending as well. And I think that there is that combination of things. I will say that ahead of the upper house election earlier in the summer in July, I was watching a lot of the campaigning for the Sanseito party. Again, you can pick your phrase or how you want to describe them, but let's just say they're populist. The bulk of they're presented certainly as having a pretty tough line on foreigners, on immigration, and so on. But actually, the bulk of what those candidates were saying to a very, very receptive audience of the general public outside. I went to a number of different stations in Tokyo and Osaka. Certainly, they were talking about inflation. That was, you said Jesper said number 1, 2, and 3. Absolutely, and those speeches were built around that. And so going back to Takaichi, I think that to the extent that the LDP was able to read the public mood, and I don't think it's guaranteed that they have a perfect read on that, but it's pretty good. This was a response to what they saw happening at that upper house election. And Takaichi, I suspect, comes the closest in the LDP to the sort of appreciation for what a household feels when compared with what those populist parties were saying. And so I do find her, I find over the last sort of few days, and we'll come back to the Takaichi trade. But one of the phrases I've been begging my editors not to slip into the copy is the idea that Takaichi's victory was a surprise. I don't think it was a surprise. I think we called this as a two-horse race between her and Koizumi. I think if a third person had won, then we would call that a surprise. If one of the two horses in a two-horse race wins, that's not a surprise. But I also think beyond that, that the level of grassroots party support for Takaichi had always been secretly stronger than the polls made it appear. And I think Jesper has been whispering Takaichi in my ear for months now. And so, yeah, I think we can come back to the mechanics of that trade and what people were betting on. But I think to call it a surprise is probably a mistake.
Yes, no, I think that's a very good point. Now, Jesper, I mean, you wrote at the weekend that about her in a quite positive way, in one sense, that she was, I think you said, not only a non-dynastic politician, but also a rare politician to actually ask follow-up questions after she'd had a briefing from you or from others, that she was a thoughtful person. But you also said in that piece that what she needs to achieve is perhaps a fiscal loosening, but also a yen appreciation. Now, she has talked about keeping interest rates lower rather than higher. Does she understand inflation? Does she understand how to deal with this?
So the answer is absolutely yes. And there is one thing that you've got to give her enormous credit for. Her mentor and role model is Yuriko Koike.
Right.
The Tokyo governor. And
Yes.
these are first generation fighters. They come from nowhere and they operate in a highly male dominated, society, not just, I mean, the political world is a disaster from that perspective, right? And
Yeah.
she fought her way up. And there's things that you have to do, right? But the reality of recognizing, right? I have to play the game. Now I'm at the top. We actually haven't heard anything from her on economic policy, literally, for the last 5 days.
Right.
And we haven't, right now, you're in this unholy alliance where, yes, everybody is quoting, my God, she attacked the Bank of Japan for raising interest rates. Well, that was a year ago. Right? For all intents and purposes. And by the way, she wasn't the only one. There were plenty of them, right, to do that, right? The reality, and she understands this very well, and this is where Japan does have a fundamental problem, which is that the traditional ways of maintaining the purchasing power of the people, of controlling inflation, don't work anymore. This is what's very interesting. We've had 5 supplementary budgets of either price controls or income support measures, which is how the government, since the first oil shocks, this is how you manage crises. They're very good at this, but it's not working because, to use an American term, inflation isn't transient. And that's where Leo's point comes in. And, the labor constraint, the capacity constraint is very, very real. I mean, just to give, if you're economically literate, when Abe started, Japan had a deflation gap. So a gap between potential growth and actual growth of more than 2%. So it was absolutely correct to go pedal to the metal on monetary policy, fiscal policy, you name it, right?
Yeah.
Today, we've got a deflation gap that is basically close to slightly positive. Right? It's about 0.3 according to the Bank of Japan on the positive side for the first time in one generation. So it's a very, very different model of constraint. And, she's going to have to come up with a policy that is going to go counter to what is today the Takaichi trade. Because for her to succeed, right, if in 6 months' time, inflation is still running at around 3%, 2.5% to 3%, her popularity is going to collapse.
Yes.
And so that's where I think it gets very, very interesting. And of course, the only way that you can do that, right, is by actually having yen appreciation. Because it's not your fault, it's not my fault. For every 10 yen that the yen goes up, you find inflation basically going down by about 0.4 to 0.5 percentage points. There's some leads and lags in the whole thing, but that's the reality because Japan is a huge importer of food and energy. That's just the way the terms of trade work.
And that, now, Leo, I mean, you recently wrote very nicely about the Teikoku Databank's wonderful curry rice price index, the CRPI in Romaji, and how this was really the fundamental measure of how people feel inflation.
Well,
how do you see this process?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. So look, I do think it's important to so when you look at the sort of classical economic approach to the value of food in the consumer price basket and the proportion represented by food, the traditional argument is, you go to an emerging economy and it's a much higher proportion. You go to a developed economy, it gets smaller, and so on. I think the problem with that is that it bears no relation to the amount of discussion that is represented by food prices. They are disproportionately talked about and reacted to, and provide that sense of prices going up. People, it is true that the price of a cinema ticket in Japan has gone up. That's not what people talk about. People talk about food, and the reason that the curry rice index is as useful as it is that it includes the cost of producing the whole dish. And so it's a range of ingredients that are, some of them fresh, some of them dry goods, so they've got rice, some of them meat, which is essentially imported and therefore very yen sensitive. There's the energy of cooking it, whether it's electric. I think they use gas as their as the cooking mechanism. There's the water bill for filling the pot and making them steaming the rice, and the electricity bill for that process too. There's also, you're buying because people, they calculate the source. You're buying a processed good as well, so you're buying something that exposes you to corporate price hikes that we know that companies have become much more comfortable about imposing. One of the things that, I mean, the audience who isn't in Japan might not appreciate this, but in the early days of price inflation in Japan, I'm talking sort of 2022 zone, so sort of post-Ukraine, and when that really started to hit, the supermarkets in Japan would routinely warn their customers that price rises were coming and would blame the supplier. They would explicitly say, because the supplier has raised prices, we're going to have to do the same. And they put themselves very much on the side of the shopper. Those signs have vanished. Everyone knows now that that's what's happening. And I think that's that's been a very important psychological transfer that I'm going back to the rice index. I think it was 300. I mean, going into sort of 2022, I was thinking about 350 or thereabouts. It's at 438 yen per serving now. And so, you think of a family of four, and you think that, well, actually, that's gone above a level that people have been calculating, and so on and so on. And I think that it's the centrality to people's perception of inflation that makes that index so useful. That the Bank of Japan, this is not in any way to detract from the various indices that the Bank of Japan looks at. Those are absolutely important. They're well chosen. They're scientific. But just in terms of the conversation, the day-to-day conversation of households, the rice index is the one. It's the most reflective, in my view, of what people are talking about. And I suppose increasingly, like you began this by saying, that's become quite an angry conversation. It's become a conversation that I, sitting where I am, I'm not. It's not for me to really say this is what every household is saying. But from it does seem to link so closely to the weakness of the yen, to this prolonged weakness of the yen. The fact that the yen is weak means that Japanese people are taking fewer foreign holidays. We know about that. Because they're taking more domestic holidays, they're more conscious of the overcrowding of tourist spots. I think there's an awful lot that is going on where the weakness of the yen is at a sort of perhaps hidden level, in some cases, a disguised level, is actually fueling some of this anger. And I don't think people would necessarily say weak yen equals all my problems, but I think it is sitting there actually at the base of a lot of those problems.
Now, Jesper, I mean, on that, I mean, as you've often rightly said, the exchange rate is an outcome. It's not a policy tool. How does anyone think about achieving the desirable virtuous cycle of a yen appreciation and declining inflation that you described?
Yeah, and I mean, if I may add one thing to what Leo just said, because, Leo, you started out by sort of normal economic textbooks, the more advanced you become, the lower your Gini coefficient, the lower your dependency on food. Well, in Japan, the Gini coefficient is actually going up. And the reason is, of course, demographics. Because as you get older, right, you're asset rich and income poor. And, you don't buy a new car, you don't buy a new refrigerator, you actually just buy food and energy. And here is a specific problem for Takaichi-san. Which is that Japanese pensions, and we got to remember that 1 in 3 of Japanese households now lives off a pension. It's a reality, right? And Japan is the only OECD country where entitlements are actually being cut back. Not dramatically. There's no Elon Musk here with a chainsaw, but Prime Minister Abe instigated something that's called the macro slide, where your pension payments increase by less than the consumer price index. Just to be specific, last year CPI inflation was just a touch above 3%. This year's pension payouts increased by only 1.7%. Right? Actually, a committee of 9 wise people, Leo, I think you should all interview them, that get together at the end of the year and sort of do a complicated debate. And in the end, there is a number that the Ministry of Finance has given them that they agree to for this to actually happen. And actually, as of October the 1st, the out-of-pocket expense for healthcare for people over the age of 70, which are 18% of the Japanese voters, the out-of-pocket expense is going up. So it's very interesting. I mean, my advice to Takaichi is the first thing you're going to have to do is you're actually going to have to do away with the macro slide. Now, the MOF is going to get angry. The markets are going to say, oh my God, it's going to be a Liz Truss moment, right? Where reckless fiscal spending, yada-da. But this is the narrow path that she's going to have to work to. She's going to have to get the pensioners, right, to feel better. The young generation is perfectly fine because you actually do see that everything that Leo talked about demand and supply in the labor market, if you are switching jobs in your 20s in Japan now, your average pay goes up by more than 40%. And job switching, is started to be a big thing. So that works for the young generation, but it doesn't work for the, for the people who are on a pension. And that's a bite. That's a battle against the Ministry of Finance that Takaichi-san is going to have to fight. Unless, and now we come to your point, unless she can get President Trump to actually stand on a podium with Takaichi when they have the Tokyo summit here on October 28, 29. And both of them have to say that they've agreed that a strong yen, a weak dollar is in the best interest of the alliance. And of course, the next day, on October 30th, we get the Bank of Japan policy decision. And I'm fully aware that the market thinks, oh, she's going to lean on Ueda. Ueda is going to be so scared that they can't hike rates. I actually think they are going to hike rates precisely because the Tokyo Accord of, yes, I'm Trump. Eventually, I'm going to get my way and get the Fed to cut by 200 basis points. And you are Takaichi, and you are actually doing your bit to ensure that I don't accuse you of currency manipulation.
No, well, that's a great theory, and that is the 28, 29, 30 that's coming up. I understand. Those 3 days are going to be a crucial thing to look at.
Oh,
When that
yeah, it's heaven for volatility traders at the moment.
Now I'm going to bring in we've had quite a few questions coming in, which are generally in the background of this, in this analysis, excellent analysis of inflation. One, which Robert Alford wrote in chat, which I'd like to ask you both about. Surely a major reason for the wages fall off, i.e. the fall off of real wages, and falling behind inflation, is the weakening of the Shunto, the spring offensive, because of declining union power and membership, and the decline in manufacturing as a sector, and therefore union power by proxy. Do you think that is a significant contribution to why labor shortage is not producing faster rise in wage growth? Leo, is it?
Yeah, I suppose that would be the favored explanation. I mean, it is less. It's certainly each year, given what you just heard Jesper saying, that the focus on what wages are going to do has by dint of an absence of any better way of looking at it, we have to focus on Shunto. I'm less and less convinced that is telling the full picture of what's going on in corporate Japan, precisely because of what Jesper was saying, that it isn't really the interesting part is no longer what they are securing at that point in the year, but what individual workers are able to secure by moving around. I mean, that's where a lot of interest. It seems, wouldn't you agree, Jesper, that
I think absolutely, and I think we can step back and do our classic labor versus capital, and the unions have been decimated, and the unions in Japan were always weak because they were company centric, rather than industry centric, and all of that is very, very true. But I think that the fundamental issue. I mean, I had this argument with the governor. Like the Shunto was basically flat for the last decade. And then it goes to 1, and then it goes to 2, and then it goes to 3. Why is it not going to go to 4 or 5 next year? Because it's just demand and supply. And this is the dirty secret, of course, is the mismatch of labor. In the sense of that the skill set that you need, right, just isn't there anymore. And we had very concrete examples of that. I started out by citing continued upward revisions in capital investment expenditure, including adding new capacity, building new factories. And it's not just Rapidus and TSMC. There's more factories being built, more capacity being added in Japan. The shortage of plant engineers and the shortage of specialized construction workers who actually can do this stuff, because I haven't done this for 20 years, right? It's kind of like the German soccer team. If you don't play well for 20 years, well then, yeah, you don't have a bench. Sorry, inside joke. But it's very interesting, and this, of course, is a problem where ultimately it's not the rules and regulation, it's not the unions that are going to make the difference, but what will make a difference is the corporate culture within companies. So, and I've said this before, to me, one of the most bullish signs about Japan is that you do have NTT Corporation, which is one of the most unionized companies in Japan, that they have moved to a meritocracy, doing away with seniority-based pay, and are introducing pay for performance. And once that starts to happen, the liquidity in the labor market, the female participation, the foreign participation, right? All of this is going to start to change, and that's exactly at the cusp of where we are right now.
So one of the things to add to that is well, and also going back to what Jesper was saying in the very early point he was making about the market for corporate control. One of the questions that we've been trying but haven't yet had a satisfactory answer to, one of the questions we're trying to answer, haven't properly grasped it yet, is whether Japan has yet got a an M&A market driven by acqui-hire. So simply M&A for the sake of getting hold of people. And I think out of these, I think it is happening in unlisted construction companies. I think that you are getting that sort of consolidation where you're simply buying a group of laborers that you can rely on because you haven't got enough of your own. But so far, none of the sort of corporates that we've spoken to, and this is across a range of sizes and a range of industries, none of them are saying that that's happening yet. They all say, well, it could do, but they don't say it's happening yet. And so, yes, definitely, they imagine that there's going to be a moment where there is a significant market for acqui-hire, so buying companies to own the labor force, but it hasn't started yet.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you look at. Sorry, to that point, I mean, there was a very high-profile case, and Leo, I'm sure you followed it. Nidec, the spindle motor company, wanted to buy Makino Milling, right? And it made sense for any analysts, and has made sense for many analysts, for the last couple of decades, right? But the talks fell apart because they couldn't agree on how to allocate labor. Because it's one thing to say, you and I on a white sheet of paper, we say, well, we can merge our labor, we can centralize some of the functions like HR management, like IT, et cetera, and therefore we get more effectively. But again, in a real world merger discussion in Japan, they spend 95% of the time trying to figure out who is going to get what job, who is going to get what title, and that all needs to be worked out. So it's not, from that perspective, an M&A-driven rationalization market. It's still a human-centric, certainly for the directors of the companies, a very human-centric market rather than a capital-centric market.
And Robert, who asked the question about the Shunto, has added a message here I want to read out, where he suggests that you look also at, in addition to the acqui-hire question, is there also a trend of buying Japanese companies to acquire real estate if it continues to appreciate in Tokyo and the market doesn't reprice a lot of undervalued real estate owned by listed companies? Is that also a growing motivation, or is that?
Yeah, clearly it is. I mean, so when you read in the FT or other lesser publications, about some big activist move, I'm thinking of sort of the biggies, the kind of Elliots of the world, and I say this, I say this with generosity. I think they make a good case for areas of the business that could be improved, areas that are non-core that could be perhaps reconsidered, and so on and so on. But nowadays, what you do is you always look through to work out what bit of property they've ended up, spotting that is sitting on those books. And I think with near total certainty, there is something enormous sitting in there. So Tokyo Gas, there's whatever, it's the building that's got the Shinjuku, the Grand, the Hyatt Hotel, and so there's a lot of property sitting in that exact state, and some of it's almost sort of comically undervalued, as we know. And so, in answer to that question, I think it'll be a while before that there isn't a property element that's somewhere sitting in the valuation story for those activists. Yeah.
Now let's just, before we kind of I come back to the other questions in a minute, which much of our thinking is on the assumption that you have this Takeichi government. But let me just check with both of you about the path to a Takeichi government. It's been traditional always to include the phrase "almost certainly" in front of will become Japan's prime minister after an LDP leadership election. Now, in this case, with Komeito reconsidering their coalition with the minority government, the almost is a little more meaningful than it ever was before, I would venture to say. Now, what sort of government do either of you think actually will emerge on October the 15th? What sort of structure in the Diet is she going to be able to achieve?
Leo, go ahead.
Leo, what are we talking about?
So first of all, just on the pure mechanism of her becoming prime minister, I do think that is I think it's quite a low bar actually to the actual to that vote, and I think that bar has been lowered by the disarray with that pervades all the opposition parties. I don't think they've got their act anywhere close to being together enough to mount something substantial that would prevent that happening. And it really only takes some abstentions. The structure of that vote means that it's a simple majority, and I think that's achievable. The thing that I suspect that you're referring to, and is going to, Jesper referred, I think, earlier to the kind of silence on economic policy and other issues over the last 5 days. Well, that silence is essentially because there's an awful lot of noise going on behind the scenes on working out exactly how this is going to work. I think the assumption is that she does not want that vote, however low a bar it is to becoming prime minister. She doesn't want that vote to take place unless there's something pretty well formed ahead of time that allows her to announce a cabinet. And I think the strong suspicion is that the cabinet will reflect certain concessions that have been made in order to get the support of perhaps Ishin, perhaps the DPP. But that there would be a cabinet position in return for perhaps one or more cabinet positions in return for that support. On Komeito, I certainly Jesper is closer to the answer to the question of how far their support is still guaranteed. I suspect that the Takaichi camp calculation is that it shouldn't be guaranteed, in perpetuity. And therefore that you're looking for those votes. But I think you're probably at this point calculating that the total number of seats that Komeito is going to control in coming years is probably going to just quietly decline as it has been doing until now. So yeah, I think an alliance rather than a full coalition partnership with one of those parties that I mentioned is probably the shape of things, and a cabinet position for one or two, perhaps members of a non-LDP party. Yeah. Yes, but what was your?
So it's very interesting. It was nice when you cut your teeth by working for many decades with Americans, because they teach you something very fundamental that is normally not immediately obvious to a German. Follow the money when you look at politics. And the reality is that nobody wants an election, least of all the Komeito, because the Komeito is the one that almost certainly is going to take it on the chin. And I think it's an even bet that, in 3 years' time, the LDP will not be in an alliance or partnership with the Komeito anymore. The Komeito is a dying party that has served its purpose, God bless them. But for all intents and purposes, in the here and now, running a minority government, right, but getting the sufficient votes on the tacit agreement that she is not going to call an election, in the immediate future. I think that that's most likely where we're going to be ending up with, rather than some new formal alliance. And if I'm right on this, she will actually be a super strong prime minister. Because remember that the one power that the prime minister of Japan has is he is the chief whip of every politician, because she can call a snap election. And, so we'll see. So, how this is going to play out, and Leo is completely right. I personally hope that Mr. Tamaki is going to become the finance minister. And what these people are asking for is actually not a lot, right? They're not asking for the consumption tax to be cut. That used to be an argument that people made, a couple of months ago. Now that we're closer to actually having to make a decision, it's even the debate of cutting the consumption tax for food prices, for all intents and purposes, is off the table. Taking away the gasoline tax surcharge. Okay, that's nice, but that's not even a rounding error, right? In the scheme of things, it's good politics, but it's nothing in terms of the budget impact. So I think the other concessions that people are asking for, oh my God, don't go to the Yasukuni Shrine, which obviously people have very strong, emotional ideas about. I think that that's certainly something that Takaichi can agree to.
Yeah, and the big question as well has been, where does her pragmatism kick in? And Jesper was just referring to Yasukuni. I mean, we saw Ishiba's pragmatism kick in pretty soon, and it stopped Ishiba being Ishiba. And there are some who may decide that's a good thing. I'm not one of them. I think it would have been quite fun to see full bore Ishiba for a little while at least, but actually his pragmatism kicked in pretty early. There's a risk that it will with her too, and that a lot of what we've written about Takaichi's views on one thing or another and what she's done will be, I think, probably diluted is probably the best way of thinking about it, in terms of the things that she may have gone into this wanting to do. And I think that like we were saying earlier, how do we brand? How do we correctly brand what sort of conservative she is, and whether it's whether we should use the kind of vocabulary that suggests it's a kind of extremist form of conservatism. Well, it's very possible that we end up seeing a very pragmatic, watered down version of anything that she's said prior to this. And I think that the call on Tamaki would be, in fact, a quite a strong signal of that pragmatism taking hold. Yeah.
No,
Well,
and Leo, look at the facts of, she's reshuffled the leadership of the LDP, and for all intents and purposes, they're all fiscal hawks. I mean, she's no dummy. She knows what happened to Liz Truss. Trust me, she knows exactly what happened to Liz Truss, right? And putting even Kobayashi, as the head of the policy, research council at the LDP, which is these are the guys who actually listen to everybody and basically pick the fights, with the Ministry of Finance. These fiscal recklessness is not going to be happening. Fiscal fine tuning, absolutely, right? But it's not going to be. I mean, this idea, which is where we get to the Takaichi trade. I mean, the Takaichi trade is, oh my God, it's Abe 2.0, where you get pedal to the metal fiscal policy, pedal to the metal monetary policy, and everything goes. That's not going to happen.
No.
I mean, no, and just to finish that off, sorry, just on the Takaichi trade, one of the companies that we wrote about today, in fact, and enjoyed watching was Poppins. So Poppins is Japan's biggest agency for renting nannies. It also runs, I think it's 330 or so nurseries. And you can say, well, look, she has in the past, she has said, let's look at some tax breaks for fees paid to nannies. Let's look at some tax breaks for nurseries that are brought in-house to companies and so on. And so the market can easily make a story out of that if it wants to. But that might, there's no guaranteeing that even something as relatively straightforward as those two things could necessarily happen with the government in its current state. So, yeah.
So we've got 10 minutes left, so we have to talk about both Trump and immigration. We cannot leave these two elephants outside our room. So but we've been addressing some of the questions that have been coming in. I mean, I think David Warren asked about whether she's going to be quite pragmatic geopolitically, or would she inject uncertainty into relations with China, Korea, and the US. I think you've both been suggesting a more pragmatic position. Others have asked, will the yen go to 200 against the dollar? The answer is no. Will she allow inflation to rise? The answer is not, if she wants to actually remain popular. But what about the issue that's driving Sensato's rise alongside inflation, which is immigration and foreigners? Gregory Evans talks about the number of posters that he keeps seeing in the countryside, promoting Sensato. How is she going to be on this issue of like the anti-foreigner sentiment that is gripping a minority, at least, of the population? What do you think, Jesper?
I have to go. Look, I think, like Leo said, I think greater clarifications, and there's a couple of bugs that are in there. And there is also a huge amount of pressure from the Japanese business leaders, right, to keep immigration open. I mean,
Yeah.
you remember you asked me a couple of weeks ago, what would the worst thing that Japan could do? And actually, the worst thing that would be to really shut down immigration aggressively. Because let us be very clear, this is not a European or American immigration debate. In Japan, anybody who comes in here with very, 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 very few exceptions, i.e., asylum seekers, of which there are minimum amounts, right? Everybody who comes here comes on a work visa sponsored by somebody. So they immediately take part in society. They immediately contribute, right, to taxes and social security, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an issue that is played up for one reason, which is that you've got a very easy way to sponsor yourself by setting up a business. If you incorporate a company in Japan for, literally the equivalent of 50,000 US dollars, right? You basically get a business manager visa. And that's where a lot of the frictions actually come from, because these are people who are rich from overseas. They are fleeing. And yes, it is predominantly the People's Republic of China. They're setting up shop here because they don't want to be in Shanghai anymore. They are off means and they just set up some flimsy business, right? And get towards permanent residency actually very, very quickly. That's, I think, where you're going to see a tightening of rules and regulation. They are talking of bringing that up from 50,000 US dollars to 300,000 US dollars. I think it'll end up being watered down to about 150,000 US dollars. But that's the biggest constraint. And I think in terms of the visibility and where the San Seito can cut in, really is the inbound tourism.
Right. Right.
Don't you think, Leo? I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so look, I think two things. One is that there has been perhaps, I mean, if you're being cynical, you'd say it's a deliberate conflation of tourism with immigration. That you're able to say, look at these rowdy tourists spending their strong foreign currencies and sort of humiliating us with how far their money goes and how far our money no longer goes. They're making the place messy and crowded and noisy and all the other things. And then there's a conflation of that with, yes, but also, here are very large numbers, statistically meaningful numbers of people that are coming into the country and occupying this portion of the labor force. Last time I went into Lawson, anyone can say, look, it wasn't a Japanese person behind the counter, and so on and so on. I think that conflation is. I hope and I suspect that is a relatively short-term phenomenon. I think it conflagrated around the upper house election. I think it's more of an election type noise. But where I think Takaichi is at an advantage actually is that I think if you could really define the anger, it's not well defined. The anti-immigration feeling isn't well defined. What it is, and I think you do get flavor of this in some other countries as well, is it's a wish that the concerns around immigration are not just addressed, but they are, verbalized by the politicians. And so the politicians need to show that they have thought about those things. And even if the answer is, look, we do continue to need quite a large number of people to keep this economy going. But yeah, we hear the concerns and here are the things that we're going to do about it. And this is, if that debate is had, there's a lot of that anger that I think will disperse, because I do not, and never had believed that this is a sort of fundamentally anti-immigrant country. I think it's not. I don't think that's the point. But what I do think, what I think you will get is that Takaichi has the advantage of having come into this with a clear position on immigration, whether we whether we like it, and in fact, whether she really believes it, is a slightly separate thing. The point is, she's come into this with people clear that she has a skepticism about immigration and is prepared to talk about it. And that puts her very, very separate to a previous generation, to 4 or 5 Japanese prime ministers who simply have not felt they've been able to get away without saying that. Even as they've opened some of the immigration taps pretty wide. And so I think that she comes into this with a position and a preparedness to have the debate that the general public want to hear. And so, to the extent that she manages to play that successfully, I think she may end up oddly, rather than stirring things up, I think she may actually end up calming things down slightly.
Now, excellent. Now, Trump, 5 minutes to go.
Sorry.
No, we need to mention that man because he's coming on October the 29th. As Jesper has reminded us, Jesper is advocating for a strong yen, weak dollar agreement, a Tokyo Accord. What else should we expect in, if you like, how Takaichi will manage this relationship? Thinking of the tariffs, thinking of the $550 billion investment agreement.
Yeah, for 30 seconds, and Leo, the one thing that Ishiba and Akazawa put off the table, the Americans, when they started to negotiate after Liberation Day, basically suggested that if you pay more for our troops stationed in Japan, that will give you brownie points. And Ishiba and Akazawa said, no way. We will not mingle economic policy, trade policy with security policy. And the Americans accepted it, and then they did whatever they did, right? But I think what you're going to see as a barter, as a gift to President Trump, is that when he shows up here, that the support budget, for the American troops is going to be significantly increased. And that is the one thing, that's something that, because Trump obviously needs a victory. Now, yes. I tell you a funny story, which Leo probably had, I don't know whether have you heard about the gold coin? They are considering printing a gold coin, right, that has Mr. Trump on it. So one Trump, that is denominated in gold. That will be a gift, for not just Mr. and Mrs. Trump, but also for his extended family. No, I'm joking. That would be made available to Mr. and Mrs. Watanabe as an investment. Of course, the gold being imported from the United States so that you can reduce a little bit the bilateral trade deficit. But anyway, that's just a rumor so far.
Right. And there have been a number of questions about defense spending. I mean, obviously, the support budget is one thing. That's a very clever, small way to give him a little victory. The pressure that comes from the Americans to go well beyond 2%. There's no fiscal capacity to agree to that at present, presumably.
I think, you can talk about 2%, whatever it is now for the Europeans. I think that the real debate inside Japan, right, is how do we ensure that we don't come beholden to the Americans on our hardware production, as well as on our software production. They said no to Palantir. They said, no, we will not hook up, like NATO did. We will not hook into the Palantir system. We're going to build our own. Thank you very much. Right? So it's quite interesting because this fundamental shift that has happened at some point over the last 6-7 years is that, the fundamental trust in the US-Japan alliance, right, has been undermined. And here in Japan, nobody believes that if Trump loses the midterm elections or if the next president is going to be a Democrat, that we'll go back to the old and merry days. Nobody in Japan believes that. So the focus is much more so than 1, 2, 3 percentage points more on GDP. The focus is on how do I ensure that Hitachi develops the stuff that we need.
Yes. No, that's a very, very fundamental point, and something that I think Japan clearly shares with Europe. I mean, that desire to build that capacity.
Where the alliance with the United Kingdom in particular stands out, right?
Yes.
And with various joint projects that are now being started, very, very important there. And the whole cooperation between the UK and Japan on cybersecurity, I think is absolutely key.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, very important point. So Leo Lewis, Jesper Koll, thank you very, very much for this extremely rich conversation. We will come back in a few months' time with another Japan Macro Salon to review how the early time of the Takeichi government has been. Some more about, I think we should talk about the artificial intelligence and what it's doing to the Japanese economy and in the Japanese stock market. But above all, to the US-Japan relationship and the adaptation of Japan to this new world. So I thank you both for your guidance in this, and thank you to the audience for excellent questions, for your participation today. And we look forward to seeing you again at the next Japan Macro Salon. Again, thank you, Leo. Thank you, Jesper. Thank you to the Asia Society. And thank you to the Japan Society.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, one and all. Thank you.